You're listening to Back Pew Convos.
I'm Sean.
And I'm Sal. And this is the podcast God wants you to listen to.
So if you want to remain in God's will, have a sit down.
Grab a beverage of your choice.
And have a listen.
You're welcome.
Are we gonna do this?
We're ready to go.
Oh.
The world is ready for this.
I don't know that they're ready for this.
Are you ready for this?
I am.
Yam? You
I
yam?
am.
I am what I am?
I am.
Yeah, so.
A real religious man. I'm reading a text from my mama.
Thanks a lot for running off all our listeners with your singing.
I'm reading a text from my mama. You know what? I have a beautiful voice, so I resent that. Voice of an angel.
In the arms of an angel.
Who's the better singer? You know what? Let's let the people decide. Hey, you just heard a line from me. You heard a line from Sal. Who's the better singer?
I didn't even sing my best song.
What's your best song?
I ain't going to do it now.
I don't know what my best song would be.
Yeah, I don't know. Probably I Will Always Love You by Whitney Houston. That one would probably highlight my skills the best.
Interesting. It's out of all the songs that I thought you would have said, that probably wouldn't have made top 10.
See, it's the only one that I know I can think of right off the top of my head that would allow me to get that much that high.
That range.
Yeah, that range.
Show off your falsetto.
Yeah.
Well,
other than that, it would probably be Barbie Girl.
Makes sense.
Come on, Barbie, let's go party. My Lord, this is already off the rails. We haven't even started yet.
I know.
Well, there's a reason why we're off the rails, and you know what? That's because we're doing something different than our usual, because it's not the weekend. We're doing a midweek recording.
We are doing a midweek recording.
Why don't you yawn into the mic a little?
We're both pretty worn down, both pretty tired.
Yeah. Yep, we're doing a midweek recording because we are trying to get some episodes banked, We want content to be able to put out to our loyal listeners.
Yeah, we do.
And so today, we're also so the last couple episodes, we're not going to release these in order, so I don't know when this is going to come out, but just to let the audience in on when we recorded it, we had just finished recording our series of response videos to Michael McClymont.
Mm-hmm.
So we recorded them in 2 sessions that were both well over 3 hours long, and so those were kind of exhausting, long, in-depth, took a lot. So today, since it's midweek and we're just coming off of a 4-part series, we decided to dive into something that's probably a little shorter.
Right. Something a little lighter.
A little lighter.
Easy breezy, beautiful.
I don't know about easy or breezy, but...
Cover girl.
So what are we talking about today?
We're talking about the parable from Matthew 25, the sheep and the goats.
One of our favorites is
Sheep and the goats.
It's been mentioned on almost every single episode, so we figured we might as well do an episode on it.
We may as well.
So right off the bat, you said it was a parable. Is it a parable?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think so. I don't think that is something that's even... Is that something that's contested by folks?
I actually didn't know it was a thing until so today I was listening to some different people talk on this parable to try to get some other ideas, and opinions and thoughts on the matter before I spoke to the public on it.
Yeah.
And somebody mentioned that. They said because most parables say outright that they're parables, or the way that they start is like, the kingdom of heaven is like, and then it goes into it. But the way that this one started was a bit different.
I mean, in context, it is surrounded by a bunch of other parables, though.
Right.
That do say that outright. That say, like, you could also compare it to this.
Right.
I do think it's also interesting. I don't know what all to say about it, but I do think it's also interesting that, given what Jesus says in Matthew 25, this is a continuation. 24, I mean, this is a continuation of what Jesus is talking about in Matthew 24.
Right.
Which a lot of that is viewed as, like, future.
Well, that same person that had mentioned that had brought that up, that this parable doesn't necessarily start like other parables, had tied it to Revelation, right? Because the way it starts is verse 31, Matthew 25:31. But when the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, then he will sit on his glorious throne. And like they related that to the section of Revelation where Jesus comes back. It's on the white horse with all the heavenly host or whatever, and like cross-reference those two together.
See, I heard someone referencing that, but saying that the Son of Man coming in his glory and what's the rest of it there? Comes in when the Son of Man comes in his glory.
And all the angels with him. He will sit on his glorious throne.
Oh. It says he will sit on his throne.
His glorious throne.
What I was reading today was talking about that being the cross, like the throne being the cross, and that is him coming in his glory. That the glory of the Son of Man is at the cross when he is enthroned on the cross.
That actually makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Actually, I never even finished the episode that I was listening to that one guy was talking about. So I don't remember what his name was, what his podcast was, or didn't even finish it, to be honest. I just ran out of time. So I don't know where he went from there.
Well,
maybe he will finish it.
Maybe. Maybe he's just wrong.
Could be.
And I'm right.
Well, maybe.
Or maybe he's right and I'm wrong. Or maybe we're both wrong.
Maybe you're both right.
Maybe we're both right. Could be.
So, do you want to start with just reading this thing outright?
Yeah, let's do that.
So, and also, before I start reading here, if my voice sounds weird, it's because I'm not feeling the greatest. I assume that most of our listeners are local, know us personally, but if you're not, if you're somewhere out there in the wide world listening to us.
The Philippines?
Yeah, like the Philippines. Here in the Kentucky of the good old US of A, it's the time of year where the weather can't make up its mind what it wants to do, and it will go from 40 degrees to 70, spend 2 or 3 days at 70, then a cold front will come in, and it'll be 46 degrees for 2 days, and then it'll go back up to 70,
right?
And it wreaks havoc on the sinuses and allergies. So,
yeah, Kentucky weather is garbage, trash, dump.
So pray for our weather, that it be healed.
Lord, heal our weather patterns, please.
So I'm going to start reading. This is Matthew 25. The first verse is 31.
Mm-hmm.
But when the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, then he will sit on his glorious throne, and all the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate them from one another, just as the shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he will put the sheep on his right, but the goats on the left. Then the king will say to those on his right, Come, you who are blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in, naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me. Then the righteous will answer him, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? And when did we see you as a stranger and invite you in, or naked and clothe you? And when did we see you sick or in prison and come to you? And the king will answer and say to them, truly I say to you, to the extent that you did it for one of the least of these brothers or sisters of mine, you did it for me. Then he will also say to those on his left, depart from me, you accursed people, into the eternal fire, which has been prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me nothing to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, and you did not invite me in. Naked, and you did not clothe me. Sick and in prison, and you did not visit me. Then they themselves also will answer, Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty, or as a stranger, or naked, or sick, or in prison, and did not take care of you? Then he will answer to them, truly I say to you, to the extent that you did not do it for one of the least of these, you did not do it for me either. These will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous into eternal life. And that's it. That was verse 46. So 31 through 46.
Yeah. So I think that the first thing that let me consult my notes quickly.
Make it quick.
So the first thing that I think is important to say is I think that we need to let this parable be what it is. Right? So like
Right.
I think that it's pretty obvious that when Jesus told this, it was meant, I think Jesus' intent was to unsettle. I don't think it was, like, I think that we need to not try to diminish the warning, diminish the seriousness of it.
Right.
I think that it was told to people that whether you were a follower or someone who was opposed to Jesus or whoever, I think that these words probably, I could just imagine that these words coming from Jesus in that moment were pretty unnerving,
right,
to his crowd, to his audience. And I think it's intended to do that. It should be unsettling,
right,
to us.
It's pretty strong language in there.
Yeah. And so I think that that's the first thing I think we should say, is that we need to take that seriously,
right,
and not try to diminish that. So, but beyond that, I think that I don't think that the intent was we shouldn't allow it to paralyze us in fear.
Right.
So that's the thing. There's a balance there. There's taking it seriously and allowing the words to cut, right? Allowing yourself to be unnerved, unsettled by it, but not letting yourself be so distraught in fear of punishment, specifically that perfect love is supposed to cast out. So like I think that we don't want to diminish the words. We want to take them seriously. We want to allow them to cut and burn away those things that are not like Christ in us.
Right.
But we should not be paralyzed in fear of punishment by this passage.
Right.
Which I think that's how a lot of people take it.
Right. Well, I think that's what the reason why this parable, more so than a lot of the others, stands out to, at least to me. I don't want to speak for you, but to me so much, is because I do think that on one hand, what you're saying there is a reality. Like, people do take these words and do allow that to take part in more of a fear-based thing.
Right.
But then also at the same time to diminish other parts of the parable. And what I mean by that is we seem to forget that what the basis for judgment is actually how we treat other people. But at the same time, super literalize the punishment aspect of it.
Right, yeah. Yeah. And I guess, like, I'm just being honest about it, where I'm at with it. It's taken me a while just because of where I've been with my deconstruction and everything, it's taken me a while to read the words of Jesus like this, these judgment texts, and not have that response of being paralyzed in fear.
Right.
It's taken me a long time to be able to trust that the same Jesus that said these words is the same Jesus that goes to the cross and dies for everyone.
Right.
The same Jesus that could have retaliated, that could have, he said that if my kingdom was of this world, I would be, going to war like the kingdoms of this world do. But that's not how my kingdom is. Like,
yeah, there's something about it being in red letters that makes it a little more difficult to not do that with, right? Like, I think there are places in the Bible where you can read like some of the harder judgment text, and it doesn't quite cut in the same way as it does if it's in the red letters. You know?
Yeah. When it's the words of Jesus, it is. I think it does, because we're talking about, because Jesus isn't just, because at that point you're not just reading the written word, you're reading what the written word says about the living word,
right?
Which, so it's, I mean, I guess you could say it's a double-edged sword in that way. You're not just getting the written, but you're getting the living word,
right?
But I think that, like, it's one thing that has been helpful for me. Like, if you're someone who is going through a deconstruction, or if you're someone that is, because of where you've been and some of the struggles you've had with fear of punishment and stuff in the past, if you're someone who has a really hard time reading judgment text like that, I just think it's been really helpful for me to just keep in mind that this is the same Jesus that we know is the good shepherd that searches for every lost sheep until they're found.
Right.
This is the same Jesus that gave us this amazing Sermon on the Mount. Mm-hmm. This is the Jesus that, again, died for everyone. This is the same. He's the same yesterday, today, forever.
Who taught us to love our enemies.
Said
that the fulfillment of the law is to love God and love your neighbor as yourself.
Exactly.
Right.
And this is the same. Jesus is God, so this is the same God. Because I always go back to that Jonah passage. Because whatever we say about, however we want to try to exegete, however we talk about this passage tonight, here's what I know. I know that whatever Jesus meant by what he said here, it won't be other than who we know Jesus to be.
Right.
It won't be other. Whatever meaning is found in this passage, it won't be other than who God has revealed himself to be in Jesus, and who God has revealed himself to be in the scriptures. Mm-hmm. And this is what Jonah says. He says, before Jonah gets the message, he doesn't even know what the message to Nineveh is going to be, but he knows God. And that's why he runs away. And that's exactly what Jonah says. He says, I knew you were going to do this. I knew that you were a gracious God, merciful, abundant in steadfast love, and ready to relent from punishing. So whatever the message is, whatever the intended message that Jesus is trying to portray here, it will not be other than that.
Right. Yeah, I think that is a good way to start this, conversation about this certain parable, because this in particular is one of the kinds of places in Scripture when I was first going through a deconstruction that did make it more difficult.
Yeah.
Because especially when, your approach to the Scriptures is that it's literal and that it's an infallible, inerrant literally, then it's hard to reconcile that view with a God who loves your enemy as yourself, but then I'm going to punish my enemies for all of eternity.
Right.
So being able to, what I think you just described, the way I would put it, is actually being able to read through a more Christocentric lens.
Right.
And, I think that this parable is a good way to frame how one could potentially do that. I don't want to say how it's done because we ain't on that level yet, but that is how we try to read this passage in particular and others, right? Like I believe that the scriptures do line up and make sense, but they do because I read them through a Christocentric lens, or I try to, although I'm not perfect.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that, again, whatever we say tonight is not the end all be all. It's not, this is
not at all.
Like, we're just going to give our 2 cents on it. And you may disagree, whoever you are, listener, you may disagree with how our takeaway from the scripture, and that's fine. But I would just ask you to ask yourself that same question. Is whatever message that I think Jesus is trying to portray here, is it congruent with who I know Jesus to be in my heart?
Right. Because
I heard Brad Joseph say this one time, and I thought it was really good. I'm not going to get the exact quote right, but he said something like, I need the Jesus of my heart to critique my hermeneutics. I need my hermeneutic to critique the Jesus of my heart. In other words, like, whenever we read the scriptures, we need to allow who we know Jesus to be to inform our hermeneutics, the way we approach the lens through which we see we read the scriptures. But we also don't want to create within ourselves a Jesus that's false to the way that scripture has revealed Jesus to be.
Right.
And constantly sort of like allowing yourself to critique the Jesus within yourself and being willing to critique your approach to scripture, I think is important.
Right.
But yeah, I would just, whatever your interpretation of this passage is, I would just ask you to do the same.
Yeah.
To ask yourself, is my interpretation of this passage congruent with who I know God to be and who I know Jesus to be as revealed, and whose his character, his nature, as revealed in Scripture.
Right.
So, well, we're going to just get into it, I guess.
Yeah, I think so. And really, I think probably the place to start is with the language of it.
Yeah.
Because I feel like there's no, I don't want to make such a bold statement, I guess. I was going to say I don't know that there is any better way to show how things can be lost in translation in English than this exact parable. Yeah. Because we've said it on this show before. Neither one of us we're not scholars. We're not versed in ancient Greek, biblical Greek. So but even with just a little bit of study,
yeah,
even somebody who's not an expert in the ancient biblical Greek can see how the way that some of these words were translated or mistranslated, depending on how you want to look at it, completely changed the entirety of what is being said here.
Oh, yeah, for sure. So, but before we get into any sort of talk about the Greek words there translated as punishment and eternal, should we say some about the beginning? Like, there were some things that I had from the first portion also.
Well, if you want to go there first.
So let me pull it up real quick. I don't even have the scriptures pulled up. You read it a minute ago, but
you weren't listening to me.
Well, I was listening, but I don't have the whole thing memorized.
You should.
I probably should, actually. I'm reading out of the NASB.
That's what I read, by the way.
Oh, okay. So
I did the NASB 2020.
Oh, I like the 95 better personally.
Stuck in the 90s.
So all the nations, it says, will be gathered before him, which I think is interesting because the nations doesn't necessarily denote individuals.
Right. I think it's actually. I mean, I know that again. That was one of the Greek words that I had, because it's ethnos, which, from my understanding, again, does generally not refer to an individual, but as nations,
people groups.
Yeah, people groups.
The definition on the Strong's, the definition is a race, a nation, or nations as distinct from Israel. So Gentiles. It's used for people, nations, heathen world, Gentiles, unbelieving Gentiles, a culture. So that is the first thing that I think is an interesting thing to make sure to note here that I think gets lost when we read this, because we automatically want to make it about individuals.
Right.
And I'm not saying that it's not.
Right.
But I do think it's interesting that the word there is ethnos and not just like a singular person.
Right. It's definitely worth noting. I think that's just part of in a lot of Western Christianity has become so individualized. And what I mean by that is it's all about like your personal relationship with Christ, your individual personal salvation. But like traditionally, this was a community thing, right? Like even going all the way back to like Israel, it's like, in the Jewish people, that was like it was a group thing, a community thing. And then the early church was so much about community. And even though like even today, like church is still a big part of our culture,
right?
I think the parts of church have become so individualized that I think that we kind of, it's easy for us to overlook that this says nations and the word means nations. Like it doesn't mean individual people. So
so the only other thing that I thought was interesting there was where it talks about I took note of the fact that both groups actually didn't recognize Christ.
Right.
Whether they were feeding the hungry or not feeding the hungry, visiting those in prison or not visiting those in prison. Neither one recognized Christ, actually.
Right.
Because the ones that did do it, they're like, when did we feed you and not know it was you?
Right.
Which
in a way, I think that makes it more, because I think if we're all being honest, like if you were... I was going to say if we knew it was Jesus in front of us, we would treat him differently. But even think about like if it was your own mom or your own dad or like your wife or whatever, like, and she was sick, you would probably treat her differently than if it was just some random stranger that was sick or whatever. You know what I mean? So I think in that respect of even the people that did do those things didn't recognize Christ, that what that does is it shows that they did it not because of who he was, but just because it was the right thing to do.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Yeah. That makes sense. So the next thing that I made note of is that I thought we might end up talking about was the whole, the eternal fire, which has been prepared for the devil and his angels.
Right.
So I kind of did. My mind wandered a lot on that issue today, and I know that we're going to do a whole episode at some point on the devil.
Oh yeah,
the devil and his angels. But
I thought we hated them.
Yeah, but it is interesting to note that like that word, because the English word devil comes from the diablos in the Greek, and the way that it's used, I mean, if you look at the definition of diablos, it is slanderous or accusing falsely. The way it's used, it's used for the slanderer or slanderous. The Helps Word Studies says that it means to slander, to accuse, to defame, a false accuser. Like it's used in the New American Standard Exhaustive Concordance. It's used 3 times, translated as malicious gossips. So there are times when that word is not even used by the NAS and translated as the devil.
Right.
The majority of time that is translated as devil, but there are times when it's translated as malicious gossips, which I don't know. That whole thing is just interesting to me, to the whole, like, what even is the Satan? Because a lot of the early church believed that, like, evil is not a thing, that evil in itself is just the absence of the good.
Right.
Like, it's that evil in itself is not anything.
It's just sort of like darkness isn't anything, but it's literally just the absence of light.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So, I don't know. I just think that the whole devil thing is interesting because, and in the context of this passage here, I kind of don't think it matters. I mean, it does, but, like, if you're someone who thinks that, if you believe that the devil is just pure evil, there's a lot of stuff going through my head right now.
You can only say one at a time.
I know. If you think that the devil is just pure evil, and he's tossed into this fire, if the fire is a consuming fire, then the devil will be consumed.
Right.
Totally and completely. And so even if because that's one objection someone might have to the whole universal salvation thing, is that, well, it clearly says that this fire was prepared for the devil.
Mm-hmm.
Well, but it depends on what the purpose of that fire is. If the purpose of the fire is to burn up the wood, hay, and stubble, and the devil is purely wood, hay, and stubble, well, then he's going to be burned up completely.
Right. I mean, it says the fire is eternal. It says eternal fire, which, I mean, we'll get into that too.
Yeah,
but just if you're reading it just in the English and not digging into what those Greek words are, it doesn't say the devil and his angels are in there for eternity. It just says the fire burns for eternity.
Right. Yeah. So, and then the word for angels is messenger, is what it means. So, I mean, one way you could read that, and I'm not, again, if you want to read it as like an actual fallen angel named Lucifer that has demons,
right?
Cool. I don't think for me, that doesn't change anything as far as the implications of it for what we believe as far as universal salvation. That doesn't factor into it for me personally. But I thought it was interesting because you could read this as it's prepared for that thing in us that wants to slander, falsely accuse, that wants to,
Yeah, essentially, to put it plainly, it's prepared for the things in us that need to be burned away.
Yeah. And then by messengers, you could just be those who align themselves with that mindset.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I also think it's an interesting thing. It's one of those things where we read some of this stuff and we know it's not to be taken literally. Like when we read that they are sheep and goats, we know he's using language there to make a point. But then when we read about the fire that burns for eternity, that is prepared for the devil and his angels, we tend to read that part literally. And it's like we don't. There's so much picking and choosing. I mean, I'd already mentioned it a little bit with some other things, but that's just another example of how, like, when we want to read some of it as figurative, but then the other parts were just like, well, no, that he literally means that, and it's which, again, to your point, maybe, I don't know, but I think it's worth noting that you're not reading any of the rest of this parable literally. Why are you reading that part literally?
Right. Yeah, the devil and his angel stuff, to me, it's like I honestly don't think it matters at all how you conceive of it. I think that it doesn't it doesn't I guess what I mean is that it doesn't matter insofar as if you're someone who thinks that this set of passages, that these scriptures here definitely put the nail in the coffin of universal salvation, I just don't think you get there, even if the devil is an actual being, sentient being with actual angels, fallen angels on his side, or whatever that means. I don't think that, to me, that it doesn't change anything.
Right. I mean, I know in our response videos to Dr. McClyman, we had mentioned, along with, of course, universal reconciliation, but we also had mentioned annihilationism.
Yeah.
And to be honest, when I read this, I would say that it's far more supporting. Obviously, I'm a universal reconciliationist, so I just got to throw that out there, that I still believe that we can reconcile these passages with that. Yeah. But I do think if the options were between, does this support eternal conscious torment or annihilationism, I think it's far stronger argument for annihilationism.
Yeah, me too.
Because just like I said, it says it specifically says that the fire is eternal, but it doesn't say that the devil and his angels were in there for eternal. And then the only other part that even mentions duration says eternal punishment, but like if you're annihilated, that's an eternal punishment. That's an irreversible punishment that lasts forever. That doesn't mean you're suffering for all of eternity, but the punishment itself lasts. It's like if you chop off your finger, you're not constantly having your finger chopped off. It's done once and there, but it's long lasting. It lasts for the rest of your life. For the rest of your life, you're not going to have a finger. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah, I agree.
So, yeah, it's, at least as far, if we just were forced to pick one of those two, I think it's far stronger for annihilationism, but I think they're both wrong.
Yeah. Well, this is probably going to be a quick one, because I don't have a ton more notes on it. I know that we're going to... So one thing I do think is worth mentioning, even before we get to the end of because the end is where all the juicy bits are, right?
Right.
One thing I think is worth mentioning before we even get to the end there is that within the context, so you have the virgins and you have the talents, these parables that precede this one.
Right.
And there is a theme of immaturity. This is something that stuck out to me anyway.
Yeah.
It's like seems to be a theme of immaturity on the part of those that are shut out or whatever,
which continues into this one.
Yeah, exactly.
Of course. I don't have the word pulled up right in front of me, but I know that the word that is translated as goat there means kid goat or young goat.
Yeah. Yeah, it means a little young goat is what the Strong says. A kid.
Which, if I remember correctly, is the same word that's used in the parable of the prodigal son, right? When the older son mentions not even getting the...
is it the same?
I think it is. I could be wrong about that, so...
Yeah.
I don't have it pulled up in front of me. I'm shooting right off the hip, but...
According to this, I think you're right. It is it's the only 2 times this is used, actually, I think.
Yeah. From what I understand, it's only used twice in the Bible, but it has been used. We have other non-biblical manuscripts that the word is used, and it means young goat.
Yeah.
Which, to the whole point, like, it continues that theme of immaturity from the whole chapter. The whole chapter deals with that, which I think it's appropriate to mention, because in the context of how I would exegete this text, and knowing what, the listeners, if you've listened to any of our podcasts, you kind of know the conception that I have of and how universal reconciliation works for me. Whereas it's not that there isn't any sort of judgment or any sort of punishment like the straw man that they like to build up, but rather it's a refiner's fire, right? There's a refinement that takes place. And I think another way to conceptualize a refinement is a maturity.
Yeah.
And, I think that's something that's important to the context of this parable is you have the sheep who are like fully matured sheep. And then you have these goats that are young kid goats. Like there needs to be a process of maturity that occurs.
Mm-hmm. Process of learning.
Right.
Or correction.
Right. Which are all things that we'll get to within this parable. But I think even just looking at it practically, like the sheep are the ones who fed the hungry and clothed the naked and took care of the sick. The immature ones didn't. Like that also just common sensely tracks with maturity.
Yeah, generally you're more selfish the more immature you are. Those two things tend to go hand in hand.
Right.
Selfishness and immaturity.
Right.
Which, I do think that that's definitely worth noting that it is a kid specifically. And I mean, goats, the difference between goats and sheep in general, like goats are more hard-headed. They're harder to control.
They are a little bit more fun.
Sheep. Yeah.
Especially the ones that faint. They stiffen up and faint. That's hilarious.
What's I can't even do it. Like the screaming goats. That's so funny.
So then, let me ask you this. If we're to look at the goats as, immature, needing correction, needing maturity, needing refining, then how is going away into an eternal punishment, a punishment that lasts forever and ever and always, a retributive punishment, how is that going to help them to mature?
It won't.
Well, then how does this parable make any sense?
It only makes sense if the punishment, quote unquote, is a correction or a remedial chastisement, a time of learning, a time of maturing.
Right, which if you haven't caught on by now, I was teeing that one up because good news.
That's exactly what
the
word
what it means.
Yeah. I actually had another thought and I lost it, but
you're welcome. I moved you right along.
Yeah. But yeah, let's just get into it.
Yeah, you got it pulled up. I don't have the strong stuff pulled up or the concordance.
Yeah, so he says, the very last verse here, it says, these will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous into eternal life. And so the word translated as eternal for us, by the way, from what I understand, the reason that it is translated, because our English word eternal comes from the Latin eterna, and that word has far less ambiguity, the Latin word,
right,
far less ambiguity than the Greek word, which is aionios.
Right.
Like eterna, almost it has some ambiguity about it too, but it more than usually it means like eternal as we think of it.
Right.
But the word aionios does not necessarily mean that. In fact, from what I understand, in the early church, those that were closest to that actually knew and could read and speak the Koine Greek that the scriptures were written in, they, most of the time when the word eternal or aionios is used, it's used of God himself alone. But there is a little bit of ambiguity about this word aionios, but there's less ambiguity about the word eterna, which is where we get eternal from.
Right.
So there.
So that's where you get the issues with it's written in a language that no one speaks any longer. It was translated into a language, which was then translated from that language into the English language. And,
yeah.
it's easy to see. And that's why not to get on too much of a tangent here, but that's why it always drives me nuts when people say things like, well, the Bible clearly says, because it's almost hard for it to get any more clear if you don't know this about the languages.
Right.
It's almost harder for it to be any more clear. If you're just reading it in English, it says, these go into eternal punishment, but the righteous into eternal life. That's pretty clear.
Yeah.
But it's not until you dig into the original language, the language that it was written in, that you start to find, wait a minute, maybe this isn't as clear cut as I thought it was. So that's why I generally say, if somebody's telling you, well, the Bible clearly says, that's somebody that doesn't have any idea what they're talking about. Because there's very little, even the most clear cut and dry things that we have in the Bible, like when you start to dig into the original language, it's not near as clear.
Right.
And there's more examples you can dig, like that are less, that don't have to do with punishment, right? Like love. We have one word in English for love.
Right.
And in the Greek, I don't even know how many like different words. You had the
like 4 or 5.
Yeah,
I think
4 or 5 for sure.
There's several different words.
They all mean different things. There's like a lustful, like romantic love. There's a brotherly love. There's self-sacrificing, love. Like all these, but we in English have one word, love.
Right.
Yeah. So anyway, that's a little bit of a tangent, but
yeah. So this word ionios, I'm gonna post an article from the Eclectic Orthodoxy blog where Father Aiden Kimmel, he goes more into in depth on this word and the history of it and the way it's used. But let me just give like a definition of it. This is according to the Strong's. I'm not doing anything fancy here.
right.
I'm going to my Bible Hub app. I'm using the NASB that has the Strong's incorporated into it, so you can just click on the word and it takes you to the Greek. And when you go to the word eternal at the end there, the word is ionios, and this is what it says in the Strong's Concordance. The definition is age long. And then it does say eternal. The usage, it says, is age long. And then this does say eternal. And then it says, partaking of the character of that which lasts for an age, as contrasting with something that is brief or fleeting. So something that lasts for an age long would denote a long duration. It's not something that's fleeting and brief and quick. And then the Helps Word Studies says an age, having a particular character and quality, properly age-like. And so there's many translations. This gets even trickier whenever you start looking at the Septuagint. Mm-hmm. The Septuagint is a Greek translation of the Old Testament. And so there's lots of things translated as eternal in the Old Testament, but this word ionios in the Septuagint that we know is not eternal, like a lot of the statutes given about the sacrifices and the all of those, like we know that we're not supposed to continue animal sacrifice. Like the animal sacrifices are not for eternity,
right?
But that's the word that's used. It says this will be a perpetual statute for you. It says that over and over again when it's laying out like how to do the sacrifices and stuff like that. And then we've already talked about it in the Jonah episode, but it says that Jonah was in Sheol, Hades,
grave,
forever.
Right.
It was, and it's that same word. If in the Septuagint they translate it ionios, but we know it was only in the belly of fish for 3 days.
Right.
And
that was the example that came to my mind right off the bat when you said that one.
Yeah, I think there's a passage in Habakkuk also that talks about these mountains that were eternal.
Right.
Well, we know that mountains have a beginning and an end. They're not eternal.
They have a beginning and an end. You just might not be able to see either the beginning or the end.
Right. Yeah.
So, to be fair,
mm-hmm.
It does say eternal as a possibility, and we are acknowledging that ionios can be used to mean eternal. not generally. And there is a word that is generally used that means eternal always, pretty much. But I want to be, I say that because I want to be fair, because I don't want somebody to say, well, you just read that. It said what you just read there in the Strong's, eternal was listed, but you didn't mention that. So I want to say outright.
I did say it.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
I just want to outright say that a possible translation for that word is eternal. So,
yeah. I mean, we wouldn't have so many translations that translated as eternal if it wasn't a possibility.
Yeah, I mean, what I want to make abundantly clear is that we're not hiding away from that. We're not shying away from that. So the question becomes, if we acknowledge that the word can mean both literally eternal or just long duration, how do we know how to use the word? So I think that that's what we're demonstrating here, because we can go on. Then if you're ready, we can move on to the word for punishment.
There's actually quite a bit more I wanted to say about Aionios.
Okay, go ahead. I thought you were done with that.
No.
Okay.
No. I read the definitions, but there's other stuff I want to say about it. Like because there is a Greek word that has far less ambiguity about it.
Right.
That could have been used here. And wasn't.
So, okay, but before we go on, let me just say that then, that we acknowledge that it can be translated as either.
Right.
But we still think that there is a way to translate it to make it make sense without just picking. It's not just choosing, like, we want it to end over here, so we're going to go with the one that lines up with the way we want it to be. And so that's what we're going to attempt to show through this.
Right. No, I mean, there are there's actually several translations, English translations of this passage that translate it as not eternal. And there is a Greek word that could have been used here, aidios, which has far less ambiguity about it. Even that one has some ambiguity about it, but it's kind of like eternal. It's far less. Like it has, generally speaking, aidios does mean forever. But that's not the word that our Lord chose to use here.
Right.
It's intentionally used the word aionios, that properly means an age. And so you have...
which we should say that's where we get our English word eon from.
Yeah.
Eon.
Right. So there is... the Young's literal translation translates it this way: and these shall go away to punishment, age during, but the righteous to life, age during. David Bentley Hart's New Testament translates it: and these will go to the chastening of that age, but the just to the life of that age.
I was going to pull up my NT right here.
Yeah, I know he translates it differently as well.
He says everlasting, at least in this one. And they will go away into everlasting punishment, but the righteous to everlasting life.
Interesting. Because I was under the impression that he translated as the age to come.
And that was the Kingdom New Testament.
The Rotherham's Emphasized Bible translates it as age abiding. But anyway, there are several translations that translate it as having to do with an age. Usually the coming age or the age to come. So, I think that translation makes far more sense.
Right.
Given the overall message here.
Right.
Because another thing to consider here is, from my understanding, ancient peoples like that, I don't know that they conceptualized time the same way that we do. From what I understand, they believed in there was a succession of ages, basically.
Yeah.
And that because when in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul is speaking about the end of the ages, that God will be all in all at the end of the ages. Well, if this is a punishment that's happening in the coming age, well, then the end of the ages, the end of all the ages,
right?
The result, according to Paul, is that God will be all in all.
Right.
And that makes far more sense to me because I don't know what you do with Paul's. I don't know how you say that God is all in all if some are eternally, consciously tormented away from the presence of the Lord. I don't know how some could. How is God all in all?
Right.
At that point? But it does make sense if we're saying that this is a temporary correction,
right.
chastisement,
which
that results in God being all in all.
Which I think, again, to reiterate what you said at the very, very onset of this, is that the words are hard words, and this, what you're saying, isn't to diminish that at all, because just looking at it logically, how long is an age? How long is an eon? How long is, even if it's not eternal, how long is that? I don't know. Nobody can say. It's
right.
It's still, at the very least, we acknowledge that the word means it's not fleeting.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And there's a lot of people that would say that we're trying to do that very thing.
Right.
We're trying to make it easier. But man, if you read some of what the early Christian Universalists, the way that they talk about this, it's pretty brutal sounding. Like, it'll make you uncomfortable reading some of like how they thought this was going to be.
Right.
Like, they're not taking it easy.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think to me, at least, and this could be just my complete uneducated mind, but the way that I envision that word, aionios, is sort of like what we described with the mountains. Like, it may be so big that you can't see the beginning or end, so that from your perception, it feels and seems like it is eternal.
Yeah.
That doesn't necessarily mean it's literally for all the rest of time, which doesn't even make sense because we're talking about things that exist outside of time. But that doesn't mean unending. It literally, but it still means like you might not be able to like fathom the immensity of it. You might not be able to see the beginning or the end. That's the immensity of what we're talking about. So whether you're talking about forever and ever and always, or just an age, it's not softening the blow either way.
Right. Yeah.
It's not it's not like you're there for 5 minutes and then you paid your dues. You know what I'm saying? Like,
yeah. So I guess that's probably the last thing that I feel like needs to be said about aionios, at least on this pod. I mean,
it comes up a lot.
Yeah.
So, it won't be the last time you hear about it.
Yeah. I am going to link this article.
Yeah.
It's on Eclectic Orthodoxy. It's on his blog, and the title is "Sometimes Eternity Ain't Forever: Aionios and the Universalist Hope." And he does a pretty deep dive into this word.
Yeah.
So, anyway, to sum up all of that we just said, basically, we're saying that it's possible that it means eternal, but from our perspective, it seems unlikely.
Right.
Given the fact that, again, the word is translated at different ways by different English translators, that the word itself in its most literal form means an age, and that there was a perfectly good word that has far less ambiguity. Like, if Jesus is trying to make it really clear here what he means by it, he could have used aidios, and that would have been far clearer that he meant eternity.
Right.
So anyway.
Yeah.
So I guess that's the last thing I have to say about aionios, the eternal portion there. So the last bit there.
Punishment.
And these shall go away to, well, I actually pulled it up in the Young's Literal. The Young's Literal says, and these shall go away to punishment age during, but the righteous to life age during. So, the punishment, the Greek word is kolossos.
Right.
And which you know about that.
I'm pretty sure it was also an X-Man, right? Colossus.
Yeah, I think so. I don't know. I never got into X-Men.
Really?
Yeah.
X-Men was one of my favorites. Not the movies. I'm talking about like the cartoons as a kid.
Yeah.
Love those. But no, from again, I'm not a scholar on the Greek languages. I'm not all that super familiar with it, but I think it's another one of those that just with a quick, pretty basic search of the concordance, you can find that it's the word colossus doesn't mean retributive punishment. It means correction.
Yeah. I'm looking at the Strongs right now. Again, I didn't do anything fancy. Went to the Bible Hub app, went to the passage with the Strongs and just clicked on it. And the word is colossus. It's, and the definition is correction. Plain and simple. That's the only word in the definition, just correction. The usage, it says chastisement, punishment, torment, perhaps with the idea of deprivation. Yeah.
And just like Ionios, if the author here had meant retribution, punishment, there is a word that would have suited and would have been much more clearer than Colossus.
Yeah. Timoria. Or Timoria. I've heard it different. I've heard it both ways.
If you're redneck, Timoria.
Timoria. But yeah, so Timoria does mean retributive punishment.
Right.
Actually, right here in the Thayer's Greek Lexicon on my Bible Hub app, it says that same thing. It says the noted definition of Aristotle distinguishes Colossus from Timoria as that which is disciplinary and has reference to him who suffers, while the latter is penal and has reference to the satisfaction of him who inflicts. So Colossus, in other words, Colossus, according to Aristotle, is the difference between Colossus and Timoria is that Colossus is disciplinary, it's corrective, and it's for the benefit of the one receiving the chastisement, the correction.
Right.
Versus the Timoria, which is retributive and has to do more with satisfying the penal, the satisfaction of the one who is inflicting the punishment.
Right.
So that's worth noting.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah, because like I was mentioning, a little bit earlier, I think when if you just wanted to start from the eternal versus age-long debate and which way are you going to go with it, I think it has to make sense as a whole.
Yeah.
And just knowing, so, I mean, again, I don't know how much more you got. I guess I'm just going to jump right into it and say it like this, that I think when you take everything, you read it through a Christocentric lens, which means you know that God is love, that Christ is the perfect example of God. I don't remember the exact wording of it right off the top of my head right here, but he's the perfect representation of God.
Yeah.
That his entire message was to love one another. That was his commandment given in the Gospel of John, was that we shall be known by our love for one another. To love your neighbors yourself, to love your enemies, knowing all that about who Jesus is. Then looking at this parable and saying that the word that's translated as goats means young, immature kid goats. The word translated as punishment means corrective punishment, corrective chastisement, not penal retribution.
Yeah. That it's specifically for the benefit of the person receiving the correction.
Right. So then I think when you package all of that together, the only way to make sense of it is that the punishment is age long. Because if it's eternal, well, number one, that contradicts the person that we know Jesus to be. I know that, I don't mean that to be offensive, but it contradicts the person I know. Let me say it like that. I don't know that Jesus.
Right.
And further than that, the parable doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
If it's a young kid who needs correction, who goes away to corrective chastisement for all of eternity without end, well, that's nonsensical. That makes no sense.
There's never a time when the kid is corrected.
Right.
If there's never an end to it, the lesson is never learned.
Exactly. That's what I'm trying to get at.
So, in order for the punishment to mean anything, for it to, as far as definitionally, which, I mean, if that's what the word means, then if he's trying to get across the idea of a eternal retributive punishment that isn't corrective and doesn't teach a lesson that is eventually learned, well, he used the wrong word.
Right. But I think that this parable is a perfect example of how hard some things can be, because I think that maybe I'm wrong, but I think there are going to be some people that hear that and say, well, you're just making the Bible say something that it's not saying. It says right there that the punishment is eternal punishment. And yes, in the English it does, but it wasn't written in English.
Right.
And that's not us trying to make it say something it doesn't say. It's us trying to make it say what it actually said.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I do have a few more things I think
go for it.
Want to say about it.
Let's dive in.
So, Clement of Alexandria, Saint Clement of Alexandria, he also makes this distinction. He explains that that intrinsic to Colossus is the idea of correction and restoration. So this is someone who, we're talking, I think he lived from 150 to 215 AD, really close to the original. He was someone who could read and speak the original
the
language and knew the culture, and he says outright that word Colossus does carry the idea of correction and restoration, not just correction, but and restoration, he says. We also have from Hebrews 12, we know that God chastises those he loves, like a father chastises his children. That's what Hebrews 12 tells us, for their own benefit. And he says in that passage there that correction and chastisement, it's unpleasant at the time, but we know that it serves a greater purpose. So given who God is,
right?
What would God chastises those he loves? Well, does he love everybody? Yeah. Is God father to everybody?
We already talked about that.
So he chastises his children, and it's for their own benefit. Even though we have earthly fathers that chastise us, is what the author of Hebrews says.
Right.
And we love them for it because we know that it serves a purpose.
Right. In the moment, though, it's not pleasant.
It's not pleasant. Exactly. What else did I have to say about it? Oh, there is a couple things that, so one thing that someone could say here is that, well, the life is eternal also. So if you're saying that the punishment is only temporary, well, then you're also saying that the life is only temporary.
Mm-hmm.
And this is actually the same argument that St. Augustine used.
Mm-hmm.
He said if it's the same word, which...
You need to be consistent.
Yeah.
Right.
So, but again, if we're talking about a coming age of life and punishment, well, we know that God is life. We have plenty of reason to believe that the life truly is eternal because the life is God.
Right.
So, and there's other passages you could point to too that don't have reference to punishment that tell us that the life is eternal. But if both things are occurring in the age to come, which is what many translations will say, this is happening during, age abiding,
right,
in the age to come. Just because both things are happening in the age to come does not mean they're the same duration.
Well, right. I mean, just think about chastisement, I guess. I don't even, and this might just be wrong, I don't know, but it's the way that I understand it, is that I think that the duration of chastisement is age long, but that doesn't mean that each individual's duration of chastisement is an entire age. It's just however long it takes them to mature, however long it takes for that stuff to be, the wood, hay, and stubble to be burned away. So from beginning of this age to the end of this age is this period, this age, but to oversimplify it and put it into terms that are almost nonsensical, but just it's easier to understand, it might take me 1 year to become fully mature.
Right.
It might take you 3 years to become fully mature. It might take somebody 150 years to become mature, but guess what? The age is 150 years long. So
right.
The age of chastisement is 150 years, but it only took me 1 year of that 150 to reach my maturity or whatever. That could be wrong. That's just me. And again, the years thing was just a way to explain it parabolically. I know that it's not set time frames like that, but
right. Yeah, I mean, I just think that that's worth noting that, like, just because both things are happening in the age to come or in an age does not mean that they're the same duration.
Right.
It's like one example that I use that is kind of silly is like, I actually think I stole it from Andrew Hironich maybe. But like if I say I'm going to go to work tomorrow and I'm going to eat breakfast tomorrow, well, I'm going to be working for 8 hours. I'm not going to be eating. What kind of weirdo would I be if it took me 8 hours to eat my breakfast?
You're going to miss lunch.
Exactly. You know what I mean? Like, just because both things are happening tomorrow does not mean that they're the same duration.
Right.
So just because the life and the correction are happening in the coming age, the age to come, even just an age, it doesn't mean that they're the same duration.
Right. I think that we tend to tie two things together that don't necessarily have to be tied together. Like, just because something fits within the age doesn't mean that it is the age.
Right.
You know what I'm trying to say? Like, it fits within that time frame, but it isn't the time frame.
Yeah.
So, and I also think about it like the age. I mean, even with the life thing, like I would consider. I mean, think about like the death and resurrection. Is that not potentially like life lasting an age and then a new age of life began? Like maybe, I don't know how to conceptualize the age thing. So maybe that's what maybe it is. Maybe that life, age-long life, does end at the end of the age. And then it's I don't even want to say the dirty word to some people, right? Maybe it's reincarnated or resurrected. I guess maybe that's the more Christian word, the resurrected into another age of life. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. I could see that. I could see there being a correction that lasts for a certain period of time, and then a life that is maybe not the fullness of the life. Like maybe there's a resurrection to the fullness of God being all in all at the end of the ages for those experiencing life in the age to come.
Right. I mean, if we're talking about the end of the ages, that means there's multiple ages, is all I'm trying to say. So like maybe each age is just a cycle. To where like that life, the life in the age to come is the life until the end of the age, and then it cycles all over again. Then we've got the next age where there's a whole nother life. And then you finally get to the end of the ages where everything is when God is all in all.
Possibly.
Maybe. I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm just spitballing it, obviously. I have no idea. But
yeah. I would be one of those that gets a little uncomfortable when the word reincarnation gets thrown out. Yeah. But,
I'm pretty comfortable with it. But I just conceptualize it like what I just explained, or resurrection. Like I think people tend to hear that word and think about it from like, if I was to die today, I'm going to be born as a baby tomorrow. And that's not really the way that I was meaning to use it there. I was simply meaning like resurrected into a new life at the end of the age and the beginning of the new age. It's like basically like life as a cycle. It's an age long. And then at the end of the age, resurrected into new life. At the end of that age, resurrected into a new life until God is all in all.
Yeah. Possibly. Yeah.
But I don't know, obviously.
Could be.
I know pretty well everything, but
one thing I do think it's probably good to hammer home real quick is, man, we need to be paying attention to what Jesus said is going to send you there. Like what makes you a sheep and what makes you a goat.
That was actually the last thing that I had that I was going to mention.
Yeah. I mean,
was just because I think, and I kind of hinted to it at the beginning of the episode when I said that it's one of those things where we kind of ignore part of it, but then like overemphasize the fear part of it. It's like, especially when people want to, because every time I've heard this parable quoted as a way to emphasize eternal punishment, eternal conscious torment, emphasize hell, it's always within that like Western evangelical Christian, like born again, all you got to do is say the prayer and you're saved. And but that is literally not what this says. Like this,
right? Yeah, if we're going to use it to talk about eternal hell, then let's pay attention to what is said that it's going to send you there.
Right. So, and I don't think that necessarily means. I want to say outright, actually, because I was trying to talk and think at the same time there, and it almost didn't come out the way I wanted it to, because I want to be very clear that I'm not trying to say that you earn your way anywhere.
Right.
That it's your works that determine anything.
Yeah.
That's not what I'm trying to say. However, I don't think that you can just ignore half the parable and just use the part that you want to use.
Right.
Now, the way that I conceptualize it is like this, and anybody that knows me and has talked to me about the works and all that stuff should know this by now, but works are the result of something that happens internally, right?
Yeah.
So it's just the fruit. Fruit isn't something like where you're just sitting there thinking, I just want to. Apple tree's not just sitting out there in the yard thinking, I just want to make an apple so bad. I want to make an apple so bad. And then until an apple just pops out, right? Like it's given sunlight, it's given water, it's in the right climate, and then it produces the fruit, right? So, to me, what this is talking about, the way that you treat other people, which essentially to me, what it's outlining is how you love your neighbors yourself. Like it's talking about loving your neighbors yourself, taking care of people, just especially the least of these, the most vulnerable, but caring for everybody, regardless of who they are. Because as you pointed out, even the people that did do right and didn't do right, neither one of them recognized Christ.
Mm-hmm.
They weren't doing it because of who they were.
Right.
And so I think all it is a reflection of something that's happened internally. So when you have Christ within you and the love of Christ buds forth from you, then these works aren't something that you will to happen. They're just something that happens naturally.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm trying to say? Like it's hard to put into words. I'm struggling to find the language to put it succinctly.
I'm picking up what you're putting down.
But yeah. Like I think
we also talk about this all the time. So.
Right. Well, I just think if you read that and you're like, oh, so what I need to do is I need to check this box, I need to check this box, I need to check this box and do all this, and then I'll get there. Like I still think it
can't turn into a checklist that you check off to earn your salvation.
Right. I still think you're missing the point. If you do that. Like the point is that like we're supposed to surrender our life to Christ. And Christ's life was service. So like when we surrender our life to Christ and say, it's no longer my life, but yours, do with it what you want to do with it. Well, the reflection that you're going to see is one of loving your neighbor.
Yeah.
So while I don't think it's a checklist that you go down and say, all right, check this box, because I'm good to go. I do think it is valuable as a mirror to look and see, wait a minute, I'm not seeing any of this in my life. Something inside of me needs to change. Not that, I need to go out and sign up to do like this mission and that and that and that and that, like just because you feel like you're obligated to do so. But if you're not seeing this in the reflection of that mirror, maybe it's time to do a little searching within you.
Yeah.
Is what I'm trying to say.
Right. Well, it goes back to that maturity thing, like a mature tree bears fruit.
Right.
So, and if that's, if you're rooted and grounded in agape love, other-centered, self-sacrificing, co-suffering love,
right.
Well, then you will demonstrate the fruit of that. And if you're not, then you should maybe check your roots.
Right.
Make sure you're rooted and grounded in agape love.
Which I can say, for me personally, it's something that I've been able to like notice within myself, is that like I've been a Christian my entire life.
Yeah.
I don't remember the age I was when I said the prayer to accept Jesus into my heart, but I was like 8, 9, like it was at Vacation Bible School, Buck Creek Baptist Church. I still remember it like it was. I could still remember the day. I just don't remember how old I was. Like it's been that long because I'm old now.
Yeah.
And for most of my life, I've been a pretty empathetic person, but there's a difference between like, oh man, that sucks for them, I feel real bad for them, to making that leap to like, I need to do something to help that person. You know what I'm trying to say?
Yeah.
And that's something that I've noticed through my maturity as a Christian, is that like it went from just feeling empathy for others to feeling like I want to do whatever I can to help the other, not just feel sorry for them, but actually help them. And not out of obligation, not because I feel like this is a checklist in Matthew 25 that I've got to complete in order to make sure that I don't go to age-long punishment, but
right.
Just something within me that I would describe as Christ. That's the only explanation I have for it, that wants to help, that not out of obligation, but out of desire.
Yeah. Yeah, that's something that I noticed. And part of me wonders if that's not, that's a maturity thing as well, right? Like, not just spiritual maturity. No, I think it is. Part of just growing up in general, I think you do become maybe less selfish.
Right. Absolutely.
As you age. But then also there's plenty of people that probably are, it doesn't matter your age, like there is like a spiritual maturity that comes into play as well. And I'm not trying to say that I'm like super spiritually mature or anything, but I have noticed since my reconstruction versus where I was at before, I'd noticed that within myself,
right,
as well.
Yeah, that's why I'm not trying to say that I'm like spiritually mature by any means, but I'm certainly more mature than I was.
Yeah,
like I don't know,
sure.
Like I wouldn't compare myself against anybody else, but comparing myself to where I was 10 years ago, 20 years ago, then I can certainly see a maturing process throughout that time.
Yeah, I wanted to share a quote from John Chrysostom that I came across in studying for this that I thought was interesting. He says, if you cannot find Christ in the beggar at the church door, you will not find him in the chalice. Which I thought was really good.
It was good.
Because it seems to me like he's referring to the Eucharist.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
Like, whenever we take the Eucharist, we're taking the body and the blood of Jesus. We're taking his life. His life is supposed to become our life. Well, his life, like we already talked about, was agape, lived out.
Right.
It was other-centered, self-sacrificial. It was love of the other. It was service. I've come to serve, not to be served. So when he says, if you can't see Christ in the beggar, then you won't find him in the chalice. I think he's saying that you won't, regardless of how many times you take the Eucharist, how many times you take in the body and blood of Jesus, you won't receive the life of Christ if you cannot see Christ in the beggar at your front door.
Right.
which I thought was really good.
Yeah, it is good.
So, yeah, this whole agape thing, it always makes me, because, I mean, getting back to again, if, like, for the whole thing to tie together, what sense does it make for Jesus to tell us to live this life, a Christ-like life of self-sacrifice and agape love and compassionate and mercy, and only to turn around and have zero compassion and mercy for the goats?
Right.
You know, that it's completely nonsensical.
Yeah. I mean, I especially think it's just because really what it comes down to is ignorance, I think. Because, like, if you really knew that something was going to have, like, that kind of negative consequences to it, then even in some of the other parables Jesus tells, right? Like the narrow door and the wide gate or whatever, and they're like, well, you know me, like, I heard you preaching in the streets and teaching in the streets and
Yeah.
and all that. I mean, it's basically like, if I would have known better, I wouldn't have done that. And then, like, to me, that just seems like the ultimate of uncompassion. What's the word? That's not a real word. Incompassion?
I don't know. I know what you mean, though. A lack of.
Yeah,
compassion.
lack of that. To me, it's like the opposite of having compassion, because it's like, obviously, you just didn't know any better, which I guess is ultimately the definition of being immature. But
Right. It all ties in.
yeah.
Yeah.
So it's like, you should have even more compassion on somebody for the fact that it's not as if I don't think most people do things that are quote unquote wrong because they want to be wrong.
Right.
I don't think most people, like, if you're talking about sin or whatever, most people aren't like, I'm going to do this today because that's a sin and because I like to sin. Like, you know what I mean? Most people, if they do, it's just because they don't know any better.
Right.
So to just dole out that kind of punishment on somebody for being ignorant is not merciful in any way, to me.
Right. Yeah. And I think that the whole point of the correction, because if the word means correction. We've already established that it does mean correction. It means correcting the behavior. So, I mean, if the point is to correct, what's being corrected is, what are they learning? What are the goats learning? They're learning compassion. They're learning mercy. Apparently, they're learning self-sacrifice. They're learning servanthood.
Right. Which I think is actually pretty cool to think about. Not cool in a good way, obviously, but interesting to know. Like, think back to when we talked about the rich man and Lazarus, and like, what's one of the things that we talked about was, like, Lazarus was in this torment. Not Lazarus, the rich man was in the torment.
Right.
But he still hadn't recognized, because he was still trying to boss around Lazarus.
Yeah.
And, like, he still hadn't
matured.
He hadn't matured.
Right.
You know, like, you can start to see it all coming together to weave into one picture, even though we're talking about two different books of the Bible, even.
Yeah,
like,
that theme of maturity is all over the place, I think, really.
I mean, that conception of the afterlife, I guess you would call it, which I think is ambiguous at best, because in the rich man and Lazarus, we're talking about Sheol.
Yeah.
But regardless, that picture,
80s.
That picture ties in so well with the picture that's been painted here now about like being that spiritual maturity and like being in that torment until all that stuff is burned away.
Yeah.
Until you learn, you know.
Yeah. Well, going back to Chrysostom's quote, the beggar at the rich man's door was Lazarus.
Right.
And he couldn't see Christ in him.
Right.
He didn't see him as worthy to, you know. So I think they do tie into each other very well.
Yeah.
He was hungry and sick and needed all those things.
Right.
And the rich man passed him by. Never helped him. So he's receiving some hard correction.
Right. Well, the funny thing is, I never had, in prep for this, I never even contemplated the rich man and Lazarus and how it tied in. But it literally had just come to me while we were sitting here talking about it. So,
yeah. And man, one thing that I always think about whenever we talk about this topic is like, and we talked about it in the rich man and Lazarus, is like, man, the Christ-like response, if there are those that are outside the city, wouldn't our Christ-like response be to say, I'll go? Like, let me go get them and bring them in. Let me go out and compel them to come in. Like, wouldn't that be the Christ-like response?
right.
You know? There's actually another quote.
Well, while you're looking that up too, I mean, what you just said there makes me think about, because for whatever reason, when we just recently did Luke 15 in Sunday school, and the one thing that, of all the good stuff in Luke 15, because it's such a good, that's where the prodigal son's at, and the shepherd leaving the 99 to find the one, and like this is where all this good stuff is at. But for whatever reason, what stood out to me so much was like verses 1 and 2, which is, it says that the sinners and tax collectors gathered around Jesus, and the Pharisees grumbled and said, look at this man who welcomes and eats with sinners.
Yeah.
And it's like, because it just made me realize that like Jesus draws those people to him. Like what you're just talking about, wouldn't the Christ-like response be to go get those people? That's literally what he did.
Yeah.
Like those were the people that were attracted to Jesus, that he drew in, right? And then of course it all ties in with the scriptures about being brought to the Father, right? Like the word means to be drug to, or be drawn in by the Father, right? To be drug.
Yeah, well, like when in John 12, whenever Jesus says, "If I be lifted up, I will draw all people to myself." That word the Greek word is helko, and it means drag, like you would drag a fishing net.
Fish net, yeah.
Or it's actually used also whenever Peter in the garden draws his sword. It wasn't like just kind of like slowly sort of trying to nudge or coerce the sword out of. No, he pulled that thing out intending to use it.
Right.
He pulled it out quick.
Right.
Forcefully.
So it just makes me think about like all that, is what reminded me of what you said there about wouldn't the Christ-like response be to go outside the gates and get those people, or to draw them into you? But that's literally what Christ did. Like we know that's the Christ-like response because we have an example of it.
Right.
Because
it's the sick that need healing.
Right.
Isn't that what he said?
Yeah, that is what he said. Or I don't remember the exact word, and it probably depends on the translation. It's not the healthy that need a doctor, but the sick, or something like that.
Yeah, it's not the healthy that need a doctor, but the sick.
But it also says like
he's the great physician.
That he saw the multitude and had compassion upon them, and then it says he healed all the sick among them, which means the fact that he saw them, had compassion on them, and then it mentions he healed the sick makes you think like he had compassion on them because it was a crowd of broken, sick people. Like it was desperate people. Like, those are the people that are drawn into him.
Yeah. People that are suffering. Yeah. So then what sense would it make for him to inflict suffering on people? The most immense suffering that anyone could ever imagine, suffering far beyond any suffering we experience in this life, and then ensure that suffering lasts for all of eternity.
Right.
What kind of sense would that make? For what we're talking about here is Jesus changing, like doing a complete 180 after we die. Does that make any sense to anyone? Like, I don't know if anyone's even still listening at this point that disagrees with us on this, but like, if you are, man, think about that. Just take that seriously, Right. Because like, we're talking about a Jesus who, like you said, he was full of compassion and would constantly healed the sick. And he was going around healing the sick and opening the eyes of the blind and loosing chains of bondage. Like,
right.
He was there alleviating suffering.
Well, and to add to another layer to that, like in that specific passage where it says that where the multitudes came and Jesus saw them and had compassion and healed all their sick, to set the stage for that, what had just happened is John the Baptist has just been beheaded. Yeah. And it says that Jesus withdrew, from the crowds. He went to be alone. You have to assume because he's grieving.
Yeah.
Like that's his cousin, first of all, but like it's pretty apparent that they had a relationship.
Yeah.
And it says that after John the Baptist was beheaded, he withdrew himself. So this is a time when he's hurting.
Yeah.
And yet he's so full of compassion that when he sees other people hurting, he leaves his grieving.
Yeah.
To go and help other people overcome their afflictions.
Yeah.
Like he sets aside his affliction in order to have compassion on others who are suffering affliction.
Yeah.
Like, so that just adds another layer to it.
Yeah. And if eternal conscious torment is real, then it seems to me that Jesus just doesn't, like, after death, Jesus turns into something other than Jesus other than what we read about Jesus and his actual earthly existence, his lived experience here on earth.
Right.
Jesus becomes something other than that after we die, if eternal conscious torment is real. I just cannot make sense of that. Well, how do you make sense of that with
right.
Jesus is the same yesterday, today, and forever?
Well, I think if we were to be really honest with ourselves, I don't think anybody comes to that conclusion on their own. And I think if people are honest and looking at it, they would agree with what you're saying there. That it just doesn't make sense. Yeah. I think the only thing that makes sense with it is that's the tradition that we've been told, and it's so hard. I mean, that's one of the hardest things as being a parent to me, is like wanting your children to be raised in in a Christ-like environment without them being brainwashed, because how hard it is to overcome some of those things. And I think that's one of those things, like if we're all being honest, I think we all know that doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
But it's so hard to overcome those things that have been just hammered into your brain from the time you were born to the time you're 40 years old. I mean, you've got 40 years worth of conditioning. So hard to break out of that paradigm.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's even hard just to ask the question, me and you have talked about it before, in private conversations about, like, because sometimes you'll get flack, or a little bit of pushback, and you're like, why are people pushing back so hard?
Right.
And, it's almost like it's because something that you're saying is resonating and it's scary. Like,
yeah,
because if you've got 40 years of conditioning and then you start to hear something that even possibly starts to let in a little bit of, wait a minute, maybe everything I've known my whole life isn't true. Like, that's scary.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
So a lot of people aren't even open to never even make it to the stage of thinking, does it really make sense that Jesus that I know would torture people? Let's not even use the word punish, to torture people.
Yeah.
Or
yeah, let's call it what it is.
I would even rephrase it this way, because some people would say, well, Jesus or God doesn't torture people. Okay, well, does the Jesus would he allow people to be tortured for all of eternity? And even I think most people would say, no, of course that doesn't make any sense. But most people don't even make it to the stage of asking that, because it's scary to start questioning things that you've been taught your whole life.
Yeah, well, all things were created through Christ, right?
Right.
Like, so even like whatever this fire, this hell, whatever it was created by the one through whom all things were created, which is Jesus Christ, which is Jesus. And again, how is it opposite of his actual, what we read about his actual life? It cannot be. It cannot be opposite of that.
Right. Jesus is immutable, which means he doesn't change.
Right.
That's a new one I learned today.
Yeah. Yeah. So he doesn't change. And so if he's full of mercy and compassion, and because that argument, I don't think it matters, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Like, we're saying that Jesus just allows it to happen, or he's the direct cause of it, it still doesn't make sense, because what we're actually talking about in the actuality of it, how it plays out, what it is that his mercy doesn't endure forever.
Right.
And that he somehow, that mercy and compassion to heal the sick and to alleviate the suffering, that his mission to seek and save the lost that he had on earth is somehow different after we die.
Right.
And I don't understand how, why is death having a say in Christ's actions?
Right. Especially since death has been defeated.
Exactly. Doesn't make any sense.
None. I agree.
Well, have we said our piece?
I think so. I think we did it good justice.
Yeah, I feel like it could have been better, but
I mean, it could have been. I know I could have been better. Like I said, I wasn't feeling great. There was a point in the middle of it where I felt like my brain was mush. But
yeah, I'm kind of tired. We screwed up, and I screwed up.
Don't implicate we in this.
I screwed up, and well, you're supposed to suffer with me, right?
I did. I co-suffered all the way to Madisonville.
So the night that we're recording this, the wives went to go play bingo in Madisonville.
bingo.
And me and Sal went to go get Mexican before we recorded. And I did not, when I left the house, I did not take my keys with me. So my wife locked me out whenever she went to go play bingo. I didn't have a way into the house. So we had to drive
40 minutes away.
About 40 minutes away to go get the keys so that we could come back here and record. So we're doing this far later than we anticipated, but
not to mention that we had basically had 40 minutes of conversation there and back. Not to mention what we talked about at the Mexican restaurant. So all in all,
yeah,
counting the podcast here, we've got 4 hours of content that we could have recorded. But
yeah, we've been talking to each other for a long time now.
No, I just really don't feel great, and I'm not thinking as clearly.
Yeah. Well, I guess if we're going to wrap up, I do want to finish with this quote. I think that it sums up in a really nice way how we just ended the conversation anyway. It's from Saint Silouan the Athonite. And he says, If you should find out that even one of your brothers is suffering outside the heavenly city, would you not implore the Lord to show him mercy and bring him in? If you would not, then your heart is made of iron, and there is no need for iron in paradise.